The last quilt was the color of a winter sunset, a deep, defiant red against the gray slush of the street. It was all My Lin had left to show for a month of stitching by candlelight, her fingers raw and stiff from the cold that seeped through the walls of her small shack. In the market of Gritstone, Montana, in the bitter heart of 1878, warmth was a currency she did not possess, but one she desperately tried to sell. The wind cut through her thin coat, a constant, whining thief. Other vendors had packed up, their carts of potatoes and salted meat sold or surrendered to the encroaching dusk. But My Lin remained, a small, solitary figure behind her rickety table. To leave meant returning to a cold hearth and an empty larder. To stay meant enduring the sideways glances and the hurried steps of townsfolk who saw her but refused to see her. She was a ghost in their town, a Chinese widow left behind by the railroad crews, a problem with no easy solution. She pulled her hands into her sleeves and watched her breath plume in the air. Each cloud was a prayer for a single customer, for the $2 the quilt was worth. $2 for flour. $2 for a sliver of bacon fat. $2 for another day. Then, a pair of boots stopped before her stall. They were not the scuffed, practical boots of a rancher or the polished shoes of a merchant. They were worn leather, dark with trail dust, but well cared for, the kind of boots that had walked 1,000 miles and were ready for 1,000 more. Her gaze traveled up from the boots, over gray trousers tucked into them, past a heavy winter coat, to the man wearing them. He was tall, and the low brim of his hat cast his face in shadow. All she could make out was a square jaw darkened by stubble and a stillness that was more unsettling than any threat. He did not look at her wares. He looked at her. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were a startling pale gray, the color of a frozen lake. He carried the cold with him, but it was a different kind of cold than the wind's. It was the quiet, deliberate cold of iron. A gunslinger. The way he stood, the low-slung holster at his hip, the utter lack of wasted motion, it was unmistakable. Fear, sharp and familiar, pricked at her. Men like him meant trouble. They were storms that passed through towns like Gritstone, leaving wreckage in their wake. She lowered her eyes to the red quilt, her last and best hope, and braced herself. He was silent for a long moment, simply observing her small setup. He noted the other quilts, folded neatly in a wooden crate behind her, the ones no one had even glanced at all day. There were 5 of them, each a pattern of salvaged scraps stitched into a new and beautiful whole. "How much for the red one?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. My Lin's heart hammered against her ribs. She swallowed, her throat dry. $2, sir." He gave a slight nod, his gaze finally dropping to the quilt. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was reaching for his gun. Instead, he pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied it and tipped 2 heavy silver dollars onto her table. The clink of the coins was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She quickly wrapped the quilt in a piece of brown paper, her fingers fumbling with the twine. She held it out to him, careful not to touch his hand. "Thank you, sir." He took the package, but he did not leave. He gestured with his chin toward the crate behind her. "And the others?" My Lin blinked, confused. "The others?" "All of them," he said, his voice flat, impatient. "How much?" She did a quick, desperate calculation in her head. They were smaller, less intricate than the red one. $1.50 each. "There are 5-inch. $7.50, he stated, not as a question. He counted out the coins from his pouch, 7 silver dollars and 2 quarters, and placed them on the table beside the first 2. The small pile of silver seemed to glow in the fading light. It was more money than she had seen in 6 months. She stared at the coins, then back at his shadowed face, suspicion wrestling with overwhelming relief. "Sir, I don't understand." "I'm buying your blankets," he said simply. "Are they for sale or not?" "Yes, of course," she stammered, quickly bundling the remaining 5 quilts. Why would one man need 6 quilts? The question hung in the air, but she dared not ask it. She worked quickly, her mind racing. Perhaps he was an agent for a hotel or the railroad. But his hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked for himself and answered to no one. When she had all the packages ready, a small mountain of brown paper and twine, he gathered them under one arm with surprising ease. He now held nearly 2 months of her life's work. "I'm at the boarding house," he said, a statement, not a request. "Room 4. Bring them by." And then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing at her empty stall with $9.50 on the table. The wind howled, but for the first time all day, Mylin did not feel its bite. She stared at the silver coins, a small fortune that felt heavier than lead. She did not yet know that the gunslinger had bought more than just her quilts. He had bought her a whole new set of troubles. The boarding house was warmer than the street, smelling of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Mylin stood in the entryway, the packages clutched in her arms, feeling the eyes of the other boarders on her from the dining room. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, looked her up and down with open disapproval. "He's upstairs," she sniffed, gesturing with a thumb. "Don't be tracking mud on my floors." Mylin nodded, her gaze fixed on the worn wooden stairs. She climbed them quietly, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound. Room 4 was at the end of the hall. She hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly. The door opened at once. The gunslinger stood there, his hat and coat off now. Without the shadows, she could see him clearly. He was younger than she'd thought, perhaps 30. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a pale white line against his weathered skin. His pale grey eyes seemed to take in everything at once. He stepped back to let her in. The room was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. He had already unwrapped the red quilt and laid it across the bed. Against the drab grey blanket of the boarding house, its color was a shock, a declaration of life. She set the other packages down on the floor. "Here you are, sir." He grunted in acknowledgement, his attention on the quilt. He ran a hand over the fabric, his touch surprisingly gentle. "My mother used to make these," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its public harshness. "Never saw one so well stitched, though." Mylin felt a flush of pride, a warmth that had nothing to do with the boarding house stove. "My grandmother taught me. She said the stitches are the soul of the work. If they are weak, the whole thing falls apart." He looked up from the quilt and met her eyes. She was a smart woman. He gestured to the pile of coins on her table back at the market. "That was payment for the goods. This is for the delivery." He held out another $1. She shook her head, taking a step back. "No, sir. That is not necessary." The price was fair. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Take it." It was not a request. Reluctantly, she accepted the coin, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, but warm. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. She quickly pulled her hand away, tucking the coin into her pocket. "Thank you, sir." "Cole," he said. "I beg your pardon." "My name." "It's Cole." "Mylin," she replied softly. He gave another small nod. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the sound of the wind rattling the window pane. He seemed to be searching for something else to say, a struggle that was visible on his face. But men like him were not built for small talk. Finally, he just said, "You should get home before the storm gets worse." She needed no further encouragement. She scurried from the room, her heart pounding a strange, uneven rhythm. As she descended the stairs, she heard Jebediah Finch, the owner of the general store, speaking to Mrs. Gable in the hall. His voice was oily and self-important. "I saw that gunslinger fella buy out her whole stock," Finch was saying. "Peculiar, isn't it? A man like that, with a sudden need for needlework." He practically spat the last word. "Nothing about that kind is right," Mrs. Gable agreed. "Mark my words, Jebediah, there's something foul afoot." Mylin hurried past them, her head down, the silver dollar feeling like a hot coal in her pocket. The relief she had felt was quickly chilling into a new kind of dread. In a town like Gritstone, being noticed was dangerous. And being noticed by a man like Cole was the most dangerous thing of all. The next morning, the talk was all over town. Cole's purchase had not gone unnoticed, and the story grew more elaborate with each telling. By the time Mai Lin arrived at the general store to buy her supplies, the whispers followed her down the aisle. Jebediah Finch stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a rag. He was a portly man whose starched collar always seemed a size too tight, strangling the generosity from him. He watched her approach with a small, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well, well, Mrs. Lee," he said, using her late husband's name like an insult. "Coming into some money, are we? Perhaps you'll be settling your account today." Mai Lin's husband had left a small debt at the store, one Finch never failed to remind her of. She placed her flour, salt, and a small slab of bacon on the counter, next to a bundle of fabric scraps she'd found in the remnants bin. "I can pay some of it today, Mr. Finch." She reached into her purse for the coins Cole had given her. Finch's eyes latched onto the silver. "All of it, I think," he said smoothly. "It's past due. And I'll need cash for these new items. No more credit for you." The bill for the debt was $4. Her new supplies were another $1.50. It would take more than half of her earnings, but to be free of Finch's ledger was a thing she desperately wanted. She counted out the money, her hand steady despite the tremor she felt inside. As Finch swept the coins into his till, his gaze fell on the fabric scraps. He picked up a piece of blue calico. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "From the bin, Mr. Finch. I was just about to pay for it." He held it up to the light, then looked at her, his eyes cold and hard. "This pattern. It's from a bolt that went missing from my storeroom last week. A full bolt." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The other customers in the store fell silent, turning to watch. Mai Lin felt her blood run cold. "I did not steal anything, Mr. Finch. I found it in the remnant bin." "Did you now?" he sneered. "Funny how a woman with no money suddenly has a pocket full of silver and a taste for my most expensive calico. You people are all the same. Always looking for a handout or a way to cheat an honest man." Humiliation burned in her cheeks. She stood frozen, the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. She had no defense. It was her word against his, and she knew whose word this town would believe. "Perhaps we should have the marshal take a look at that little shack of yours," Finch continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "See what other stolen goods you have stashed away." "That won't be necessary, Finch." The voice came from the doorway. Cole stood there, framed by the bright winter morning. He hadn't entered with a swagger or a threat. He had simply appeared, a silent, solid presence that immediately shifted the balance of power in the room. He walked slowly toward the counter, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic jingle on the floorboards. Every person in the store, including Finch, seemed to shrink as he approached. He stopped beside Mai Lin, not looking at her, his pale grey eyes fixed on the storekeeper. "The lady is a seamstress," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She buys remnants. She bought a bundle from the freight agent in Three Forks 2 weeks ago. I saw the receipt myself when I bought her blankets. It listed blue calico." Finch sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now see here, this has nothing to do with you. You made it my business when you accused her of theft," Cole said. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the counter. It was not a threatening gesture, but the effect was chilling. "Now, are you going to sell her the goods she came for, or are you going to have a talk with Marshal Thompson about false accusations? Because I have time for one of those conversations today." "Your choice." The store was utterly silent. Finch stared at Cole, his bravado deflating like a pricked balloon. He saw something in the gunslinger's eyes that made him swallow hard. Without another word, he pushed Mai Lin's purchases toward her and turned away, busying himself with rearranging jars on a shelf. Cole waited until she had gathered her things. He then placed another coin on the counter. "For her trouble," he said, before turning to her. He nodded toward the door. My Lin hurried out into the cold air, her lungs aching for breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Cole followed her out, the silence stretching between them. She wanted to thank him, but the words were stuck in her throat, tangled up with fear and a confusing surge of gratitude. He stopped her with a light touch on her arm. "He won't bother you again." "How did you know?" she finally managed to ask. "About the receipt? I never showed it to you." A flicker of something, was it a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "I didn't. But a man like Finch, he builds his life on bullying people he thinks are weaker than him. All you have to do is show him you're not weak." He paused, his gaze searching her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was shaking. "Yes. Thank you, Cole." He held her gaze for a moment longer. "Walk you home," he said. It wasn't a question. The walk to her shack on the edge of town was quiet. The snow crunched under their boots, the only sound in the frozen landscape. When they reached her door, she turned to him. The shack was little more than 4 walls of rough-hewn timber and a sod roof, but it was hers. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. "You made an enemy of Mr. Finch." "He was already my enemy," Cole said simply. "I don't have much use for men like that." He looked at her small, tidy home, then back at her. "I bought the old Miller claim, north of town. Figured it was time to build something instead of just passing through." The admission surprised her. Gunslingers were rootless. They didn't buy land. They didn't build things. He seemed to read her thoughts. "A man gets tired of sleeping on the ground." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a deed of title from the Territorial Land Office. He unfolded it for her to see. The name on the document was not Cole. It was Cormac Donovan. "Cole is a name I used for a while," he explained, his voice low. "Donovan is the man I'm trying to be." Here was his secret, offered to her as simply as a handshake. He was a man trying to outrun his own name, his own reputation. He was trying to build a new life in Gritstone, and his defense of her had just put that new life at risk. He had seen in her something he recognized in himself, a person trying to make a place for themselves where they were not wanted. "The quilts," he said, changing the subject. "They're the first thing I've bought for the cabin I'm building. A house isn't a home until it's got some warmth in it. You make warmth, my Lin." The sincerity in his voice undid her. He saw her not as a problem, not as an outsider, but as a creator of the very thing he was seeking. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching horse made them both turn. It was Deputy Miller, a young, overeager man who served as Marshal Thompson's eyes and ears. He reined in his horse, his expression grim. "Mrs. Lee? I need to have a word with you." He glanced at Cole, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Alone?" Cole didn't move. "Whatever you have to say to her, you can say to me." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Jebediah Finch filed a formal complaint. Claims you've been selling goods made with stolen materials. He wants the marshal to search your property." It was a nightmare. Finch hadn't backed down, he had escalated. He was using the law to crush her. "That's a lie," Cole said, his voice flat and cold as a razor. "Might be," the deputy conceded. "But it's his word, and he's a respected merchant. The marshal has to investigate. I have a warrant." He was reaching into his steel bag, but Cole stepped forward, placing himself between the deputy and My Lin's door. "You're not going in there. That's interfering with a territorial officer, Cole," the deputy warned, his hand now resting on the butt of his gun. "Don't make this ugly." My Lin's heart was in her throat. This was her fault. Cole had defended her, and now he was facing down the law. His new life, his Donovan identity, it would all be destroyed in a cloud of gunsmoke and rumor. She couldn't let that happen. She stepped out from behind him, her voice small but clear. "It is all right, deputy. You can search my home. She looked at Cole, her eyes pleading with him to stand down. I have nothing to hide. Cole's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked from her to the deputy, a silent battle raging within him. To let them search was to subject her to the humiliation. To fight was to destroy himself. He made his choice. He slowly raised his hands, palms out, and took a half step to the side. It was a gesture of surrender, and it cost him more than any fight ever could. The deputy dismounted, a smirk on his face, and pushed past them into the small shack. My Lynn stood her ground, her spine straight, and watched him go. Cole stood beside her, a silent guardian, his presence a promise that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The deputy's search was brutish and quick. He upended her box of fabric scraps, tossed her spare mattress, and rummaged through her meager possessions, finding nothing. Defeated and angry, he stormed back out. There's nothing here, he grumbled, avoiding their eyes. But the marshal will still want to talk to you. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word. My Lynn sagged against the doorframe, the violation of her home washing over her. Cole's hand found her shoulder, a steadying weight. He found nothing because there was nothing to find, he said. It doesn't matter, she whispered, her voice trembling. Finch will keep trying until he drives me out. No, Cole said, his voice firm. He won't. He looked down at her, his grey eyes full of a resolve that was both terrifying and comforting. This ends now. 3 months later, the last of the snow had melted, and the mud of gritstone streets had finally given way to hard-packed earth. The first green shoots of spring were pushing up along the creek beds, a stubborn promise of new life. So much had changed. Cole, or rather, Cormac Donovan, had ridden into the marshal's office the day after the search. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply presented Marshal Thompson with 2 things, the freighter receipt for My Lynn's fabric, which he'd calmly retrieved from her things after the deputy left, and a carefully worded letter to the territorial governor detailing a pattern of harassment and false accusation by a prominent merchant against a widow under the marshal's protection. Thompson, a fair man who disliked bullies more than he disliked paperwork, had a long, private conversation with Jebediah Finch. No one knew what was said, but Finch never bothered My Lynn again. In fact, he could barely meet her eyes. The town, which had been so quick to judge, was just as quick to change its opinion. Courage was a quality they understood. Cormac's quiet, unshakable defense of My Lynn had earned him a grudging respect that his reputation as a gunslinger never could. And by extension, that respect began to fall on her. My Lynn no longer sold her quilts from a rickety stall in the market. She now rented a small, disused storefront next to the blacksmith's shop. A simple sign, painted in clean black letters, read, "Lynn's Fine Quilts and Seamstress." Business was steady. With the railroad set to arrive by summer, the new hotel owner had contracted her to make blankets for all 20 of his rooms. Her days were filled with the hum of her sewing machine and the quiet satisfaction of her work. One warm afternoon, the bell above her shop door jingled. Cormac Donovan stood there, his hat in his hands. He was no longer the grim, shadowy figure who had first appeared at her stall. The sun and the hard work of building his homestead had settled him, carving new, softer lines into his face. He looked less like a storm and more like the sturdy pines on the hillsides. "My Lynn," he said, his voice holding a warmth she had come to know well. "Cormac," she smiled. "Is there trouble with the cabin?" She had helped him with curtains and linens, small touches of comfort for his new home. "No trouble," he said. He walked over to her work table, where a new quilt was spread out, a vibrant pattern of spring greens and golds. He touched the fabric, just as he had that first day in the boarding house. "I came to show you something." He unrolled a piece of drafting paper on the table. It was the plan for his cabin, drawn in a surprisingly steady hand. It was simple and strong, a main room, a bedroom, a kitchen area. But on the east side, overlooking the valley, he had drawn a new addition. A small room with a large window. "The main house is almost done," he said, not looking at her, his finger tracing the lines of the new room. "I thought I'd add this on next. Gets the morning light." A good room for detailed work. He finally looked up, and his pale grey eyes held hers. He wasn't a man of pretty words or grand declarations. His heart was in his actions, in the solid things he built and the people he chose to protect. "There's no stove in that room," she observed softly, her own heart beginning to beat a little faster. "The main house has a stove," he replied. "Big enough to warm the both of them." It was not a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense. It was something more real, more honest. It was an offering of space, of light, of shared warmth. It was the plan for a life, laid out in charcoal on a piece of paper. He was asking her to help him build not just a house, but a home. Mai Lin looked from the drawing of the small room to the face of the man who had seen her when no one else would. She thought of the single red quilt in the freezing market, a desperate plea for survival. Now, she was surrounded by color and warmth, with the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the drawing, her small, deft fingers covering his larger, calloused ones. "It's a good plan," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "But I think the window should be a little bigger. To let in more light." A slow smile spread across Cormac Donovan's face, transforming him completely. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it was as bright and as welcome as the spring sun pouring through her own shop window. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.